Hi everybody, my name is Jeremy Whalen. I am the new Director of Content and Production for CTV. Before we get into the class tonight, which is going to be basically focusing on exposure theory and shot composition, some introduction also to the different things that you might come across, technical jargon that you might see in regards to some of the newer technologies. Before I get into that, I just wanted to let you guys, introduce myself because I am new, and kind of explain a little bit about the philosophy of what this transition means. So, like I said, my name is Jeremy. I graduated from the University of Massachusetts. I grew up in Massachusetts. I have a double major in history and film. And for the past 3.5 years, I've been working in community media, primarily in Northampton, Mass, and also doing consultation. The thing that I really want to just applaud is the fact that all of you are in this room and you're here totally on your own, just because of your own motivations, and to see that this, in your compassion for community media. And that is so important. Coming from Massachusetts, where the legislative hurdles are a little different, California is in a real time, especially for community media, is in a real time of crisis. And this is, we're trying to implement systems here that are really, there is this unprecedented. So the fact that you're all in this room and you care about community media is really a testament to the fact that there is hope and that we can create change, and that change can be a positive for the future. I just wanted to show you something real quick, a couple of different pieces. First, it's one that was made back in Northampton, and I'm just going to show you like 30 seconds of this. And then I'll show you another production. This right here was a project that we did in Northampton that was veterans. These individuals ranged in the age of between 60 and 85, who came to us, our organization, and said, "We're going to the Washington Memorial, the Veterans Memorial. We want to capture that." And we said, "We want you to capture that." And what that meant was they didn't have any training. They didn't have any way of expressing their story or recording their history. So what we did was we gave them cameras, hoped for the best, came back, and we helped them edit that. And we put together a piece that literally had people in tears at the end. And they were so thankful for us. So community media is so much more than just the technical aspect. It's about expressing your story. It's about getting all those stories that fall through the cracks in other points of media. It's not always about the 9 o'clock news showing Justin Bieber getting arrested for egging a house. It's about the story that the Sentinel might refuse to cover because they just don't have the staff. And so we fill in those cracks, and we produce that media, and we produce that subculture. And that's why it's so important for community media to persevere. Jumping from that, here's a little piece, and I'll give a shout out to Amber over here, who helped me produce it yesterday. This was produced yesterday, and this is, I show you this because it shows what we're able to accomplish. And Paula too, hey, and thank you to Paula as well. This is a piece that we produced yesterday, and why I show you this piece is because this is really what we're striving to do. We're mixing the idea of expressing that story and doing it in an efficient manner. This was a 30-minute 3-camera shoot that myself and 2 volunteers produced, and we finished that. We finished the production shooting at 11:30. We had that edited, exported, uploaded, and delivered to the RTC, who is the client, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So we're talking about hours of turnaround rather than weeks, rather than months. We're talking about updating systems so we're efficient, so we can tell those stories in a fresh, new manner, and looking at these technologies that exist and using them to our advantage, just like the 9 o'clock news does, and just like these big media conglomerates do on a daily basis. So we have these tools, we have them available, that access is available, and what we're doing is we're looking to really make the most of what we have. And that's my little spiel before we get into the shot composition and exposure theory. Yep.
Turn your fan on and switch it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I see it. Oh, did that screw around with you guys? I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that's just there. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to introduce you guys to is a couple of different numbers that you might see spanning different cameras. And I'll just give an example here, and I'll go over what each one means. Okay? You might see this on the camera and say, what the heck's going on here? There's 3 different parts of this equation, and all of them are referring to different things. So the first part that we have is resolution. Okay? What video is it's a sequence of images that is being recorded at a certain at a certain amount of time per image to create the illusion of motion. Okay? The lowest the human eye can allow that motion to be is about 15, but we're usually higher than that. Okay? For the frames. But back to resolution. This is going to be the size of each one of those pictures, okay? So, if I bring up, that's not it. If I bring up this, you can see that this is corresponding to what we have here, 1080. What that number is referring to is the amount of lines of resolution vertically. So here, there's 1,080 pixels going vertical. You might see this number, it's slowly changing, so we're going to the horizontal, but this is 1080 by 1920. Okay, so you might see it on some cameras as 1080, some cameras now as 1920. That's considered full HD. We also have 720 HD. You can see the difference in the size of the picture that's being created. Again, this is it's being displayed on a 1080p screen. But what we have, you can see that if you were to blow up this 720 lines of resolution to try to fit up into the 1080, if you're going to stretch that out, you're going to have some quality loss because you're enlarging those pixels to come out to that 1080. So the higher the resolution, the better the quality. Now there's a lot of things, I say that with the quotes because there's a lot of complexities in this that at higher resolution, you might have an iPhone that shoots 1080p, but you might have a digital SLR that shoots 720p, and you're going to say, wow, that the quality on the digital SLR is better. Well, there's a lot of other things coming into play there, but what we're concerned, basically at this point, the cameras that we have, the AG HMC 150, for instance, the back one back there, we're shooting at 1,080 lines of resolution vertically, and that's pretty much the standard now. Not necessarily for broadcasting purposes, but they still will deliver HD at 720 on some channels. But for our purposes, if we can record, the higher that we can record with media that it's at now, with the amount of storage that's on a card, a 32 gigabyte card, 64 gigabyte card, 128, we now can, we don't have the limitations that we used to. Another thing that you have to think about with your resolution is the processing speed of your computer. Here, all of our editing computers will be able to handle 1080, a 1080 resolution. Moving forward, there's already TVs coming out and cameras coming out with 4K technology. You might hear that, or 8K, Ultra HD. That's the technology that's coming out. They're referring to something that we're just getting bigger in size of those still images that creates that video. Okay, Does anybody have any questions in regards to the resolution? Yeah.
I thought they had a little machine you could take them DVDs and pump them up to the full hard drive thing on your own. If you want to show them on your place, why couldn't you do that for all the?
So when we're talking about recording digitally, there's recording digital and recording analog. So if you had film, for instance, film is actually when we're talking digital recording. If you were to take film technically has infinite resolution. So if you were to take film, as long as you could enlarge that to a certain to fit here, you're going to be able to get pretty comparable to here. That's why that was the biggest change in shift from digital, basically the shift in the film industry from analog, just from film reels to digital, was the fact that it wasn't up to snuff. The 1080 is not really a resolution that they were shooting in. Nowadays, if you saw, for instance, basically there's been a shift over the last 10 years from 90% and 10% digital to 90% digital, 10% film, because that the analog tape is going to record we're not talking about digital resolution here. We're not talking about lines of resolution. It's going to be different. Now, digital DV tapes and things like that's when it gets tricky, because you can have a mini DV tape that is standard definition, or you can have a standard, or you could have a DV tape those are digital tapes. So it's an analog tape, but you're going to do a digital conversion onto it. It's a little complicated, but for our purposes, and again, because we've basically migrated from digital videotapes, from those DV tapes, we're going to be looking at resolution a lot more closely than film did back here.
So you don't have a machine to put your resolution up to the full hard drive from the DVDs?
So from yeah, from here to here, yeah. If you have a digital copy of that, it's gonna be. I don't know the techniques for. Yep.
Can I just interject something?
Yeah.
The systems that upconvert the digital media do it by interpolation. Okay. You're talking about how much data is stored on each one of those as they go up. In size.
Yeah.
You've got more points of data. If you look at the old newspaper photographs with a magnifying glass, you get the concept of what pixels are.
Yeah, and if you take it from still image enlargers.
You have, those pixels to work with.
Exactly.
So once you start trying to enlarge, it's like enlarging a picture. Okay. And the same thing with film photography. If you start enlarging 35 millimeter negative, you start to get grain in it. That's why people went to 2¼ or 8x10. So you can make them bigger, but they're going to be fuzzy looking, and at some point,
exactly. And I mean, we could just do that with any image. If you just take an image on your computer, for instance, in Photoshop or anything, and you start enlarging it, it's gonna just start degrading in quality. So we have the technology to take this and just scale it up, but as we scale up, we're degrading the quality of that.
You say 1080, but those are horizontal lines. There were 10,080 horizontal lines. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm just talking about vertically. There's vertically. Yeah, yeah. Good clarification. That's the amount of lines going this way. They are going horizontal.
Yeah, okay.
Is it always a relationship to 1920?
This is going to be a ratio of 16:9. So that's basically, we've changed from SD, the HD standard is now 16:9. That's the ratio. So as we go up, we should start seeing things that are doubling the 16:9 ratio. I'm not going to do, here would be, 2160. You might see. So that's pretty much the standard that we're going to see, is a ratio of 16 and 9. So that's the ratio here. Does that make sense?
That doesn't look like a ratio of 9 to 16. It looks like 2 to 1.
Here to here?
1920 is almost double 1080, right?
Okay, but that's just
No.
a picture on a blackboard. Anyway,
It is almost 2 to 1, actually. It's close.
yeah, 9 times 9 is 16,
9.
or 9 times 9 is 18, 16 is close to 9.
1080 divided by 1920. 0.56.
1280 by 720, that looks like 9 by 16.
So this ratio is correct. This ratio is correct. We're saying it's almost double, but if you were to say this is 10/20ths, this would be 2 to 1.
Right, or almost 2 to 1.
So that would be 2 to 1, but it's 16/9. It would be 9/18ths, 9/16ths. It's 0.56.
720, that looks like it's 16 by 9.
They're all 16 by 9.
16. Yeah.
That's what he's saying, is the ratio. If you move up 16, if you move up 9 in one direction,
It's
you're gonna
0.56.
move up 16 in the other direction.
Yeah.
There's 1080 rows and 1920 columns.
And this does factor out. I mean, we're saying if you doubled this, it's not quite that. So this would be, if you were to just double this, and the ratio would be 9/18ths. But we're really close, but it's not quite. So it's 16 exactly. Exactly.
Is that called what? I mean, there's
Aspect ratio.
aspect ratio of an old-fashioned TV is 5 to 4.
4:3.
It's 4:3. Yep.
4:3?
Used to be.
4:3. That's standard definition. So aspect ratio. If you want to, we can
And there's 3 aspect
do the math.
ratios, right? There's like
There is 2 to 1.
16:9 and then 2 to 1.
But for our purposes, especially with technology that we have here, the aspect ratio is 16:9. What we're looking at for resolution is 1080.
One quick question.
Yep.
Sorry to backtrack a little bit, but you never covered what the P was, and I assume.
Yep, we're going over that right now.
Perfect. I assume the 30 was 30 frames per second.
Yep. So we have resolution. The next one is going to be the type of recording, okay? Recording. You'll see a P here, or you'll see an I. This we could get into another. Big talk about the complexities of the way that the video is actually being recorded. But this is going to tell you how that video is recorded. And for the sake of expediency here, we won't go into the actual technical ways that everything's recorded. But what you will see is it's either going to be P or I here. And what that is referring to is P is for progressive scan, and I is for interlaced. Okay. And what you will see in video if you're shooting interlaced is jigsaw patterns like this during motion. I don't know if I might be able to make that bigger. But do you see that kind of jigsaw pattern here? It has to do with the way that the video is being.
Lines and odd lines.
Exactly. But what we want to do when just basically, again, I don't really want to go into the complexities of that recording, but we want to know that if you're in P, you're pretty much fine. If you have an interlaced recording at the end or before, when you're transcoding your footage, if you're bringing your footage from one type of file to another, we want to de-interlace that footage, meaning that we want to get rid of these lines, and this is a good before de-interlaced and after de-interlaced. So these cameras, for instance, I've noticed that before we shot the Gail Rich Awards last night, before they were in interlaced, so I need to set those to progressive, so I didn't have to take that step to go in and de-interlace all that footage. So again, this you'll see either P or I. A lot of digital recording now is P. You will see I. I is usually when we have a frame rate of 60, and that's the next thing that you'll see here. This is frame rate. the basic standards for frame rate are going to be 24, and that's for cinema or film. 25, which is European television, which we really don't. You'll see that on cameras, but you'll see that's why you'll see it. 30, which is US TV, and 60, which is, you will see 60. 60 will be news and sports related, although these are slowly becoming intermingled in different ways. And the frame rate is really going to be a way that you can define the aesthetics of your piece. I think I have a little video here with some annoying music that I might have to mute. So this is at 24 frames per second. Just watch the ball and watch how many kind of skips and delays that it has. And that. Oh, one more. And so you can see that that movement. Thank you, F43M. You can see the movement is going to be a little bit jittery in the 24 frames, and then it gets a little better and a little better. That is going to be, aside from the fact that you might say, oh, well, don't you always want smooth motion? You've been trained over the years to really accept these as standards for different things. And the best example I can give of the kind of abruptness of this coming into play, and not necessarily this, but frame interpolation, is the fact that some new TVs have something built in what's called frame interpolation or true motion, and it will actually guess the frames. So if something is 30 frames, it will look like everything is very, very realistically moving, and it's often called the soap opera effect. So you might not want to do that. We've always been kind of trained that when you go to the movies, you're seeing things in 24 frames per second. And when you're watching TV, that's 30 frames per second. Now, again, all of this because digital media is so prominent, a lot of this stuff is changing. So for instance, The Hobbit, Peter Jackson shot in 48 frames per second because it translates better for 3D entertainment. So these things are kind of standards that are kind of changing, but they're things that you want to think about aesthetically when you're choosing how to shoot a production. It's also something from a production standpoint that you want to pick. So say you're doing a documentary or anything that's going to be multiple shoots, you want to pick that frame rate and stick to that frame rate. You also want to pick your resolution, stick to that resolution. And you can't, you're not really going to deviate probably if you're using something like this, but you basically want to stay progressive. So these things are going to span multiple shoots, and it will also span cameras as well. So if you have 3 cameras on a shoot, you want to make sure that all of these things are standardized on those cameras. So you're not shooting 720, 60 frames per second on one, 1080, 24 frames per second on another. You want to standardize this stuff over multiple shoots and multiple cameras. Yeah?
Might you have a handout at some point that says, for these kind of activities, these...
Oh yeah, that's a great idea.
So
yeah.
Like you said, if you're going to do sports, if you're going to go do a football
Yeah.
game, you'd want to choose settings that were
Yeah.
appropriate for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great idea. I did that at our old organization. We'll probably have different cheat sheets inside of the bags in the upcoming weeks as we build out these systems, because these are good reminders. It's always nice to have just a checklist in front of you or things like that. That's a great idea. Does anybody have any questions on this before we move on to? Yeah.
Well, doesn't frame rate and speed also and pixels all determine how much memory you're going to be absorbing?
That's yeah.
If you're limited on memory sticks on a field shoot, you might not be able to go to 60 because you don't have enough memory to do that.
Yep, and that's a great point, because if you really think about it, once we bump up to 60 frames per second here, we're bumping up that from 30 images in that second to 60. So it's essentially doubling the amount of data. Now there are other limitations. So for instance, you might see on a camera the ability to have 30 frames per second, but once you try to get to 60 frames per second, you have to shoot in 720. That's because the read-write speeds of the cameras might limit you. I know that you can shoot 60 frames per second at 1080p, but that is something to consider. I will say, on the other hand, on a 32 gigabyte card shooting at 1080p, 60 frames per second on that, you're going to get hours, at least 2 hours of footage, I believe, on those cards. So it's something that storage capacities have basically been outperforming camera technologies. So we're at the point where those 32 gigabyte cards, or those, I wouldn't really want to say 16 gigabyte cards, but in the future we're probably anticipating, hopefully, getting at least a couple of 64 gigabyte cards. So it will become a moot point. But that is a great point to bring up, that you have to, in the past we've definitely had to manage those, and now we're kind of getting to the point where our storage capabilities are surpassing our camera technology. Yeah.
So in Final Cut Pro, we then have 29.97 frames.
Yep, that's just going to be the transition for different algorithms. It gets really complicated, but 29.97 is going to be the digital equivalent of 30 frames, or 23.96 is going to be 24. So you'll be using those fairly. They're basically interchangeable. Another thing to bring up, in the future, we will be shifting. We will still have Final Cut 6 and 7 on computers, but we will be making a migration to Adobe Production Premium, which will include a lot of different tools. That includes Premiere for video editing. That also includes Photoshop for photos, After Effects, a whole bunch of different goodies that kind of come into play. And just kind of a side note, but we will still retain copies of Final Cut 7 and everything. But you'll see that media will play a lot better with the updated software and the updated the updated codecs that come with those updated softwares.
Is the Adobe somewhat industry standard too? I mean, can you?
Yeah. We've kind of been in the predicament where Adobe just has recently actually upgraded to a Creative Cloud system, which is it was too much of a financial burden to get a monthly. It basically went from a one-time payment to a monthly subscription, and we would be looking at thousands of dollars for multiple licenses over many computers. So we will have the previous version, which is CX6, but it's a very it is industry standard, and it is there's a whole bunch of non-linear editing systems. Non-linear editing being Final Cut, Adobe Premiere, Avid. There's a whole bunch of different systems, but they ultimately do the same thing. I mean, non-linear editing is, back in the day, you had film and you had to splice film, and if I had this piece, I needed to put this piece together right here, and I needed to go from this to that. Now, because of digital timelines, we can start editing here, we can drop something in here, we can drop something over this right here, we can cut this and move it down a little bit. So we're not working from A to B, we're working at any given time on any given part of the timeline. Yeah, and part of this the training is going to be learning nonlinear. And if you know nonlinear editing, the philosophy doesn't change throughout each program. Yeah.
Just to make it on a easy level to understand, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
I heard Nick say that Adobe is a monthly fee, and Final Cut you have to buy the whole program.
Yep, and
But you said something about how that's not true, or that is changing.
it's not true with CS6, and that's why we'll be purchasing a production premium CS6, which is basically the last version of the production premiums.
It's on the monthly
that
payment.
that's not on the monthly. So that's ultimately the reason why we chose to. It's just it's
You just buy the program, you don't have to pay.
buy it, we own it, and we get a nonprofit discount for that. A significant nonprofit discount, which was one of the big things.
So we as members or individuals can go and purchase the monthly payment Adobe program, which is more current, is that what you're saying?
Yep. I will say, just like when you go from Final Cut, if you have a project in Final Cut 7 currently, and you try to go to do it in Final Cut 6, you can't. There isn't. You might be able to save the project. I haven't been able to get versed in Creative Cloud, but you might be able to save just like you are in Microsoft Word. Instead of a docx, you can save to a previous version as a doc. You might be able to do that with Creative Cloud, but generally speaking, when you're working in one updated one, it's hard to go back to the other one. So I wouldn't want to say that you can in that before.
Is there much difference between CS 5.5 and CS 6?
That was probably from CS5 and 5.5, excuse me, to CS6 was the biggest change for the aesthetic interface, I would say, and also a lot of different features that they added, which are some really cool features actually. So everything, if you know CS 5.5 and you know the shortcuts and everything, basically a lot of those things stayed the same. The things that changed were that they changed the look of it a little bit. It's a little bit more sleek, and it was just a kind of visual interface design that they did. But there's some big differences in the fact that you have some different things like stabilization, Ultra Key that's built, some of the plugins that Adobe purchased, and then they just baked right into the software. So you don't have to. So if people do keying, for instance, that's baked right into Premiere in a very, very nice way. So there are some significant changes, but I would say if you're familiar with nonlinear editing and you're familiar with CS 5.5, that switch is pretty easy. Yeah.
Is that on an IBM platform then now, or are we still on Apple?
Nope, it's still on Apple. Yep, still on Apple. Yeah, I'm sorry.
How do you guys take into consideration the charging for bandwidth is what you're suggesting now?
In regards.
Yeah, from the news a couple of days ago.
So the nice thing is that so bandwidth is going to be a topic of conversation for uploading and downloading things. When we're working, and there is bandwidth in regards to when we hook up our FireWire 800 cable or our FireWire 400 or our Ethernet cable for storage. Yeah. So when you there's bandwidth in regards to that, but that's bandwidth from one device to another device that doesn't involve your internet service provider. So if Creative Cloud, which is cloud-based, although you download that software, it's cloud-based. If you're shifting files from that cloud, that could potentially, if in this situation we had to pay for bandwidth, that would be something to look at. But because we'll have things on hard drives in-house in a local network, we won't have to worry about that. Yeah. Okay, so moving on from here.
Storage basically only 50% more?
I don't know if it translates exactly into 50% more. I would have to look at the numbers, but it's something that's going to be more. It's going to take up more space, and you'll see it on the card. If you switch from one to, if you have a 32 gigabyte card in the camera, for instance, and it will tell you how many minutes that you have left, and you'll see that number change just by simply going from 30 to 60. But I don't know if it's exactly double.
HD, and I'm like, oh my God, this hard drive.
Yeah.
Even a full 1 hour program is like
Yeah, I remember buying a 4 gigabyte SD card for $250 and thinking it was the best invention ever. And now we're looking at, I think they're coming out with 256 gigabyte cards. That it's technology moves at a surprising speed. But thankfully we won't really have to consider having to downgrade our footage for the sake of space on a card at this point.
What's the range of the video cameras that exist here in frame rate?
So we have everything from from that 24 to 60. I should mention that there are cameras that will go higher than 60. In fact, there's cameras that go much, much higher than 60. And if anybody watches, if everybody's going to be watching the Super Bowl, you'll see cameras that do incredible slow motion, and that articulation is something that it's because these cameras are shooting 1,000 frames per second or 2,000 frames per second or even much, much, much higher than that. So there are the capabilities, but for consumer purposes and cameras here, we're looking at between that range of 24 and 60.
If something says 60 interlaced, that means it's really doing 30 and showing half a time.
Yeah, I didn't get to that, but it's a pulsation of it's a different recording but yeah, for our purposes it's 60 frames. And yeah, and on now to we'll talk about shot composition. I just want to see how I'm doing on time. 6:45. Okay, not bad at all. Okay, so we're going to go over two more things. We're going to go over shot composition and exposure theory. I'll leave shot composition for the end because it's a little bit we're in the technical jargon right now. So we'll stay on that, and then we'll get into the nice camera and demonstration part. So exposure is going to be basically in layman's terms, it's going to be the amount of light that you have in that is coming into your camera. And what we want to do is we want to have a healthy amount of light that comes into our camera, and that will give us a healthy exposure. So for instance, if I change this over to HDMI 1, put on my camera, and I'll use Amber as my guinea pig, we can see that there's going to be a difference when we're too light on something and we're too dark on something. We always want to maintain a healthy exposure, and you can actually see an exposure thing down here. I'm using a digital SLR for our purposes, but you will see that the things that I'm talking about for exposure are basically they basically parallel the things that we're talking about for video. So exposure is going to really be affected by three variables in which we call the exposure triangle. Okay, all three of these things are acting in conjunction with each other to give you your exposure, and all of them are going to affect ultimately the amount of light that comes into the camera, but also each of them are going to have a different attribute that it will change aesthetically. Okay? Just really quick, before we even delve into the exposure triangle, I like to explain this to people because it's nice to know for just camera purposes how the heck we have a camera that is seeing what's going on here and we're getting an image. So on any camera, you're going to have what's called a sensor. Now, I do not recommend you do this, but if I shut off this camera, and I take off the lens, again, I do not recommend you do this. Here is a mirror, but under here, if I lift this up really carefully, never do this, there's a sensor right under there, okay? The sensor is what reacts to the light photons that are coming into the camera, okay? And on that sensor, we have millions of microscopic buckets. So we have our grid here. And by the way, that's what's going to give you the megapixels on any camera. It's going to be the megapixels is the millions of buckets, so however many buckets this way times this, and it'll give you some crazy number. I think we're up to camera phones, which is kind of ridiculous enough, that are generating 50 megapixels. I think the human eye is around 500, so we're not quite there yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get there in the next 25 to 50 years. But we have, this is a side view of these buckets, and again, this is all simplified physics here. And when the light comes through the camera, comes to the sensor, light falls into these buckets, and that's ultimately how we're going to see the lightness and the darkness of a pixel. So if we were to look at this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and this was represented as pixels on the camera. 2, 3, 4. The lighter, the more pixels in a bucket, that's going to be the lighter the pixel, okay? The less is going to be until it's eventually just all black if there's nothing in there. On top of that, there are red, green, and blue filters. That's why you might see RGB in still photography or video. It's actually going to be on top of these is a breakdown of filters of 2 green, 1 red, and 1 blue. And that's dependent on the amount of red, green, and blue data that it gets from this is how you get the color of that pixel. Again, it's not something that you need to know every single day, but it's something that is interesting to say the least, but also gives you a little bit of know-how to on things. Usually it's because green is the layer that's going to give you the most information. So if you have if you can get the most information out of your green channels, then the ones with least, it's just because it's broken into 4. That's I believe called the Bayer array. There's different technologies that will be coming out, but this is standard in every camera as of right now. But it's because that green channel is going to give you the most information and is the most receptive to light. So back to how we handle those photons coming in and the light coming in. The first thing we have here is the iris of the camera. The iris of the camera is going to be actually the iris of the lens. That's also known, you'll also see aperture. Iris is actually referring to the mechanical mechanism, so I'm going to put aperture up here because that's more appropriate. You might see aperture. Oh, I always do that because of video games. There's a company called Aperture in a video game. Okay, aperture. You'll also, these are kind of, they're used interchangeably, but they don't exactly mean the same thing. This is the iris is the mechanism here. Aperture is the actual, what we're referring to is the actual size. And then you might see f/ or f number, okay? All of these are referring to the aperture, okay? And if I bring back my, actually before, well, no, I'll do that right now. If I bring back my computer, you can see that it can be a little, yep, come on. Yep, f-stop, yeah. So, and the exposure, what we're talking about here goes back to analog video as well. So these things haven't been really outdated since the invention of the camera. So yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So what we'll see here is this is where it can get a little confusing for people. This aperture is going to refer to a ratio, okay? And the lower the number here is actually going to mean the wider that lens is open, okay? The wider the lens is open, the more amount of light that is going to be allowed to come into the camera, okay? So here we can see that this is f2. If we go higher in that number, we're closing, and the limit, usually the limit that you'll see on cameras is somewhere in the 22 to 32 f22 to 32 region. So what this is saying, again, we're always going to be affecting the amount of light that comes into the camera. So the lower the f number equals more light. But what I said before is that every one of these is going to have a different attribute that it affects aesthetically, independent of the others. But they're all going to affect light. So the lower the f number, the more light. But the lower the f number also equals shallower depth of field. Depth of field is going to be the amount in which we have a subject in focus. And what that means is there's going to be converging lines of where the absolute focus is. There's a set point where those lines will converge focally, and from that point things will get more blurry. From that point, both in front and behind that one point. Okay, so I'll give you an example here. Turn on my camera again. Switch over here. I'll give myself a healthy amount of light. And notice that here, myself and my marker, and I can probably get the heck out of the way, is really not in focus at all. As I move, I'm going to eventually hit, it's going to get less and less blurry, and I'm going to hit the point of convergence where that marker, well, if I could actually have, I'll move it to be in front. Where that marker is in focus. If I go this way, it's blurry. If I come back, bring that marker into focus, this is where there's a convergence line. If I bring it this way, it gets blurry, okay? Although the entire marker here looks like it's in focus, right here, it's actually one absolute point, but our eyes will allow a certain leniency when it comes to what we consider out of that depth of field, okay? So a horrible drawing of this is going to be, say I have a camera. Well, before I get to that, so again, the lower the f number, more light, lower the f number, but also the shallower the depth of field. So say I look at this in front of the camera, okay? And we can see that those colored buttons right now are out of focus. That select button right there is in focus, and then really shortly thereafter, those other buttons go out of focus. I'm currently at 3.2, so I'm very wide with my aperture right now. With my f number is low, so my lens is really opened up. If I bring this number down, and again we'll go over this, but I'm needing to compensate for bringing up my iris, so that's going to affect the other two variables that are going on. But now that I bring this up here, I haven't changed the focal length or anything. You see now it's darker, but that select button is in focus. Now we can see what the letters on those multicolored buttons, and we can see up to basically those volume buttons. So we've increased the depth of field here by bringing that F number up, by decreasing the aperture, okay? So again, for our purposes, these are the two things that you need to know. And that's what depth of field is going to represent. One thing to note, I'll get you in 1 second. One thing to note is that as you get farther away, if you're getting something farther away, as you move away from that camera, if your depth of field was like here, for instance, as you move away from the camera, that depth of field grows as well until eventually what you'll see on lenses is an infinity symbol, where your focal length at that point is just infinity. Okay? So again, you never just trust, oh, that's 100 yards away, so I have to hit infinity. Dial that in, because you definitely need to dial that in. But as you move away from as you move away, because of what that ratio is, as you move away, you're getting depth of field too. And you saw that when I'm right up next to something, your depth of field can be, millimeters, inches, if not millimeters. So it's not always like that on cameras. The sensor size will definitely come into play with those, but it's something that you can definitely use and use to your aesthetical advantage as well. Question in the back?
Yeah, the type of light, indoor, outdoor, that has a bigger effect on this also, right?
So, yep, it's going to, the biggest effect that's going to have is that you'll be able, in really well-lit situations, you'll be able to work within a much bigger, you'll have a much bigger range of apertures to work with. You'll also probably need to use something that's what's called neutral density, which is basically sunglasses for your camera. You'll see it as switches usually on cameras that go up the side, and it will be like 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32. And so as you go up, it's kind of grading that down darker and darker. So you can be at you can have your iris open 2.8 while you're in the complete sun. Because if you have a full open iris in sun, you're going to completely be whitewashed usually, dependent again on our different other variables here. But yeah, I would say that working in a low light situation here, that camera back there, for instance, is that iris is open as wide as it can go, because we're kind of starving for light in this. This is called neutral density. You'll see this is ND filter. Usually for video cameras, they'll be baked in. If not, there'll be something where you can attach it to the lens, and that will be something that you can just put on. And it will bring down the amount of stuff.
That automatic thing, if you push the ND button, it'll automatically go to the bright lighting too also. So I've seen that on the cameras when I go out and do interviews for Voices from the Village. The ND blinks when your camera's not working properly.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I'm sure it exists. I haven't seen where the automatic ND works in. I've seen a lot of instances where the auto iris will come into play and start moving around, but this will be different, because an ND filter is a way to cut down the amount of light while not affecting your iris, while not opening or closing that. But good call. So there'll be different types of filters. So there's, for instance, a UV filter that will filter UV light. There's even like infrared filters, some really cool things out there. Usually it will be a lens attachment. So that will be, for instance, this is a UV filter right here. There's also polarizers, which will bend light differently and really bring out, for instance, skylight. So there's different filters that we have for cameras that are used in different purposes. I would say the most common filter is going to be your ND filter, because it allows us to go out in broad daylight and still have a good range on our aperture.
And why do we want to have a larger aperture?
Okay, so for instance, if we're shooting,
Sports.
yeah. So that's a great question. So we're going to be at f22, for instance, something high where we're going to have a lot of depth of field when we might be moving around. If we're trying to follow somebody, we can't afford to have our depth of field be this much. If we're following somebody around, or if we're covering sports, that's a great example. Because we want the full context of what's going on. We don't really. It's different when you're going to have a shallow depth of field. Typically, this can change as long as you're comfortable shooting in different environments.
Bright outdoor lighting gives you small aperture, gives you large depth of field. So
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that, because the outside is going to give you a lot of light to work with, but it doesn't necessarily tie you down to having to be in that higher F number, because we have things like neutral density. So the amount of light in an environment is going to change, is not going to be representative of necessarily representative of having to pin any of these into one thing. I would say that if we're in a really bright situation and we don't have a neutral density filter, we're going to have to have a low gain or ISO, which we'll get to in a second. That's going to be first and foremost. And then if we still don't have a neutral density filter, we might have to be here, so that might pin us. But usually you have different tools that will help you.
sort of saying, what is wrong with a small aperture? Why would you not want a small aperture?
Oh, so
It gives you a large depth of field.
so
Portrait of somebody.
So you want to not have the large
Out of
depth of field.
focus, out of
Oh,
focus.
you want that. Oh, so you want a small.
yep. So it will be a matter of aesthetics. So for instance, you might want to go, if I'm doing a movie and this was a syringe, for instance, there's a certain emotion that's conveyed by just seeing that syringe up close and then focusing onto the patient after that. So depth of field is used as usually a dramatic aesthetic. But if there's something that we're just shooting for contextual purposes, and it's going to be something that it's going to give us a little bit more leeway to play around with, like I said, like going out and following somebody, it's more forgiving to be at a higher. It's more forgiving to be at a higher f-stop. Yeah.
Well, on that neutral density field, you have those numbers, 132.
This is the amount of light that it's going to cut down. So this is 132. This is 1/32 the amount of light. This is 1/6 the amount of light that's naturally coming into the camera. You will also see that some cameras will have filters that will say the amount of stops on the camera that it will be going down. When we talk about f-stops, usually those numbers are going to be certain ratios that are always in cameras. So for instance, you'll usually, if it can go low enough, you'll see 2.8 at f2.8, and you'll see if I pop on the camera again.
So is that like f-stop on the filter?
Yeah, these are going to be. This is just a different way of saying that it's cutting down the light, but you might literally see a representation of it's a ND and it's cutting it's 2 stops. So what that means is when you put that filter on, if we were at 9, it's acting like 10, 11. So it's acting like an 11. So because what it's doing is it's cutting down the amount of light. I shouldn't say that it's acting like that, because we're not doing when we put that filter over, we're not doing anything to the depth of field. We're just doing it to the amount of light. So you would still be at, if I put that filter on right now, that 2-stop neutral density filter, it would look like this, but it would give me the depth of field of this. And that's why we use neutral density.
Stops it down, right?
Yep, it will stop it down. Yep.
Do they use those for shooting during the daytime and making it look like night?
There are day to night filters. They're pretty much they're less common nowadays. If you watch there's a lot of different cool techniques that they've done with not only lenses but just things back in like the silent film days that they've done with day to night. But there are different filters that you could definitely use for that. Nowadays they just throw up these huge. If you ever seen Django Unchained, he literally had a football field's worth of LEDs that were simulating moonlight. So, I mean, if on bigger productions, they don't need those filters because they can just bring in whatever light they need. They can literally simulate the moon at this point. But yeah, there are filters for those things. Okay, so that covers aperture, iris, f number. Now we are on to, see if I can get some of this stuff off. Now we are on to shutter speed. And it's been a few months since I actually started, since I taught this lesson. So I'm going to go back to this for a second to use an analogy that I'm going to bring back to this guy. Okay? So remember those photons I was talking about in the sensor? Imagine those photons are people, and they're trying to get into the Super Bowl. Okay? And there's people here, which represent the photons. And there's a door right here, okay? And on the other side is the Super Bowl, okay? There's a few different ways that we can control how many people come into the Astrodome. And the aperture in this analogy is controlling the size of the door, so that we can either have it open really, really wide or closed really small. So if we have a door that's double doors, a lot of people can come in at once. If we have a little doggy door, people have to get on their knees, they have to crawl, light's going to trickle in, okay? And that's why a small aperture or high f number is going to let just a little bit of amount of light in, okay? But we also have different other variables on this door, okay? So for instance, say we've decided that we have a regular door, but we have a doorman in this case, okay? And not only is the door open, instead of the door always being open, we have a door, we have the size of that door, we open the door, 30 minutes later, we close that door, okay? So we let an amount of people in, they're filtering in, but we've actually closed off that door, okay? That's what shutter speed is going to do in this analogy. It's opening up the shutter to allow light into the camera and then closing it off, okay? So usually what we have, there's different ways a camera will, don't want to delete my shutter speed, but usually how this is done in a camera, or at least in this camera right here, is a rolling shutter, okay? So if we just constantly had light coming into this camera and had no way of articulating each one of those images, then I would be standing here. Oh, actually, I can probably show you. And I'll have to take a still image, but it will work. If I didn't have a way of articulating a stop of where that light was for every single image, I would have motion all over the screen. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by, I gotta pop this off for a second, and I'll bring this down. And let's try this. So if I left this open in the, so, let me try that again. Yeah, I'm doing the time exposure. And if I leave this on for a second and I put my hand here, and we go back to view, you can't even see my hand here because it wasn't in a position long enough to record what was going on, and the shutter didn't happen to roll over, make that one image, okay? So if I try this again, and I leave my hand here, and I go back to this, I have my hand, but, oh, that's a bad example, but it's going to be a little bit blurry, okay? what's going on here is that we need some way of saying, stop the light. This is the articulation of one of the single pictures. Go on. We need to go on to the next.
So you're literally exposing the film.
Yeah.
That's what we used to do. We used to expose film.
And the shutter is going to be something that's used in still photography and videography. But essentially, in the layman's terms of this, just like here, the lower the shutter speed, and actually, before I write that, I'm gonna put shutter speed, just like f-stop is in f/number. Shutter speed is 1 over a number here. Okay, so what I say here is the lower the denominator, equals more light, because again, everything is going to affect the amount of light coming into the camera, all of these, but they're always going to have one attribute that they're going to be controlling as well. But the lower the denominator also equals more motion blur, okay? So I'm going to put this back to film mode, and you'll see exactly how this will work out. Let me bring this up to. So this is me putting my hand in front of the camera at 1/30th. So this number here, it's saying 30, but it's actually 1 over. You'll see it on those cameras and other video cameras is 1 over the number. So right here is at 30 frames per second. You can see there's a lot of blur going on. As I increase this, it gets darker, but the articulation in my hand is getting more articulated. That motion is getting less blurry, and it's getting more articulated. Okay? So again, the lower the denominator, the more light that's coming into the camera, but also the more motion blur. Now, when do you think you would use a higher shutter speed? Exactly. Fast movement, where you really want to articulate what's going on, and that usually is sports. That's usually fast, NASCAR type things, fast cars. So again, the lower the denominator, the more light. The lower the denominator, the more motion blur.
Question for you.
Yep.
Would you do the same thing for little hummingbird photos?
So if it was still photography,
Like, no,
yeah, or
like a hummingbird floating in front of a little flower.
yeah, exactly. So if you're really trying to get the motion of a hummingbird, now I'll say basically the only way we'll get a hummingbird is with one of those really high speed frames per second cameras. But those do exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I can crank this baby right here up to 1/4000th shutter speed.
That's of a second. It's of a second.
It's going to be, yeah, exactly. So it's also, you'll see that number is going up. It's not going up just willy-nilly like 31, 32. It's going up divisible. It's usually a pretty seamless way into going into frames per second. Usually on video cameras, this is a bad example, but that camera right there, if we're using 24 frames per second, you'll see the shutter speed as 1/24th, 1/48th, and so on and so forth. Usually it just goes to 1/100th or 1/60th when it gets to that. But you'll see it kind of divisible by the frame rate. It's not always true. Like for instance, this is operating in 30 frames per second, but I could go down to 40 on this. But this might be represented as something that's easily divisible into your frame rate.
Just to make sure that I got this clear. So if you're shooting at 30 frames a second and you're shooting at 1/30, then that means it's going to every 1/30th of a second, the aperture is going to open up and close, and it will open and close at at 1/30th of a second. So basically, it
Yep.
will be open the whole time that frame is being shot, and it will close. Then if you go to 160, it will only be open half of that frame.
Yep, exact. So I didn't want to get into, I tried to avoid the mathematics here, but I'm going to get into it anyways. So it would be 30 frames per 1 second. Every 1 second, there's 30 rolls of the shutter. So that's a ratio of 1. So it would be one circle, like open, close, open, close, open, close. Yep. And that's also why when you're dealing with shutter speed, the lowest you really want to go, because it's just like when we get down to 1/15th of a second for shooting your frames per second. If you go, say you're shooting at 24 frames per second, and you try to go down to 1/12 for a shutter speed, you're gonna get more light, but it's gonna look like people are robots and they're moving kind of weirdly, and there's a lot of motion blur. Yeah, you have to have basically you have to have at least a 1-to-1 ratio. Oh, this ratio needs to be 1 here. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you'll need to be at 1/24. Some don't allow you to do that, but I've seen cameras that allow you to go lower. If you're shooting Requiem for a Dream or something, go for it. But for our purposes, usually you'll be at something that's double whatever your frame rate is.
So basically, the fraction is how long the aperture is going to be open per frame.
Exactly.
How long in seconds. So
Yep.
1/100, it's going to be open for 1/100th of a second on
Yep.
each frame.
Yep. Well, and that's where it gets tricky, because people go, oh, well, wouldn't that mean there's going to be 100 different images there? No, it's just it's just chopping it up.
Just means
Exactly.
that the light, for that frame, you only get this much movement.
Exactly.
Don't they use 1/60th for TV?
If something is so if that's why I generally say that if it's going to be double whatever your frame rate is. So usually people like to stick to, for instance, if you're shooting at 1/24th, 1/48th. But TV, because we're shooting at 30 frames per second, it would be 1/60th. So they like to do that. I usually shoot things at a 1 ratio if I really need to. I really can't see a huge difference. But generally speaking, a lot of videographers like to keep that at least double the frame rate. And now we move on to our last little piece here, and I think I deleted shutter speed, so I'll write that back over here. And again, the lower, so shutter speed, the lower the denomination equals more light, but also equals more motion blur. And now we're on to our last little piece, and that is represented by, I'm going to give you two different things here. They're not exactly, they're very similar, but you'll see it in still photography, or if you're doing videography on digital SLRs, you'll see it represented as ISO, or you'll see it represented as gain, okay? This one's probably the hardest for me to describe. Both that it's very complex, so the actual sensitivity is very hard for me to even comprehend. But essentially what's going on here is that the way that the sensor is receiving information and processing that into a digital representation into a digital visual representation is through electricity, and also what's going on in the camera is certain magnetic properties and principles that are in the camera. So when we use gain, is going to be a way to up the sensitivity of the sensor to whatever light that you have allowed that is coming into your camera. This is an example that really simplifies this, and I'd probably get shot by the person that makes the ISO sensitivity and these super ISO cameras that comes out. But say we have our buckets, and say here's 3 buckets of a representation of our on our bucket or on our sensor, and we have one pixel or 1 photon that fell in this one, 2 in this one, and 3 in this one. Okay. Now, this is actually going to be represented on that RGB scale of 0 to 100 here. So I'm just simplifying it. But this is 0 to 100, 0 to 100, 0 to 100 for every pixel. And based on that, it's going to give you the lightness or darkness and the color of that pixel. But say we have 1, 2, and 3 photons in each one of those buckets, right? And it was really dark, okay? Really, we have a really dark image. It's not showing up. Well, theoretically, if I have the digital information for this, so if I understand that in relation to all these other buckets, I have 1 photon here, 2 in this, and 3 in this, couldn't I bump this up, the sensitivity, across the board to make that 2, 4, and 6? So what it's doing is it's taking those RGB representations on the scale of 1 to 100, and it's increasing the sensitivity. We're not getting more light into the camera. That's not what's happening, and that's why I say that it's more light that's coming into the camera. It's not more light. We're synthesizing that process, and we're making the sensor more sensitive to the light that's coming in. So what does that mean? Usually that means that, well, nowadays it's changing, but the higher the gain or ISO equals more light. I put those in parentheses because you're not actually getting more light, but it's going to look like you're getting more light. But it also means more noise, okay? And noise is that grain, okay? Is that horrible grain that we all pull out our hair because of. So for instance, if I have, Amber is my guinea pig here, and I can see that here I have a healthy amount of my, get her framed up. I have her here, we have enough light, everything's good. If I wanted to shoot at f16, I would have to bring up, or not f16, but at f, and actually I'm going to go down for a second. Go back to 2000, put this up. I'm going to go into times 10 zoom here. I'm going to zoom up on a cup. So this is a digital zoom. And if I go into that cup, I can see that, you see that little movement around the screen? You see how it's kind of going like that? That's the noise, okay? Now watch, this is a times 10 zoom. Watch what happens in this, and I'm an ISO of 200. This would be analogous to being, well, no, I won't say that. But if I increase to 6400 and I bring that down so we get a better healthy exposure, and I come in, now look at what's going on. We're getting more of that noise. So noise is going to be, and that's another good thing to look at too, is the fact that in those darker areas it's even more prominent. Okay? So noise is a degradation of the quality of our film. We don't want to see noise. And usually what I say about increasing the gain or increasing the ISO to something that's at the level of 6400, or in gain is represented, ISO is going to be represented as a number. 100 is usually the lowest, although sometimes it's 50, which is kind of weird because 100 is representative of 100 as a ratio of 1. So there's no increase. But that's usually 1 to, gets crazy now. They get up to like 25,000. Gain is represented as decibels, okay? If you're ever using gain, you might find yourself have to, and I'll tell you when you would. If you're having to use gain on a shoot that you control, you're that you have. So for instance, you have lights, you have an environment that you're working in. If you're using gain in those situations, then you're not controlling your environment to the degree that you need to. So you might need to bring in, if it's too dark, if you're trying to do an interview with somebody and it's too dark, you might need to bring in a softbox light or something to bring in to get those light levels on that person good. So gain, I always say, is the last resort. The time that you do use gain is if you see some atrocity like the Rodney King beating. That video is horrible, shot compositionally. But imagine if we didn't have that video. Imagine if that grainy footage wasn't there. If you need to get something, if it's context that matters most, yeah, go ahead, pump up that gain. If it's the last resort, pump up that gain. If you could do anything in pre-production to avoid using gain, do that, because you'll save yourself a lot of headache in both matching footage with things, making a professional product. So does that make sense? You're going to see in cameras here, you're going to see gain as decibel. Usually in the 6, it will be represented as 3, 6, 9, 12, something like that. Yep.
I just wanted to offer this to you. The thing that comes to mind is an analogy to bruise, even though, that would be sensitivity as opposed to light, but it's funny you brought up Rodney King. You don't want it. It makes noise, and it don't look pretty.
Yeah.
So,
I'm gonna take that one for next time. Thank you. So I'm just gonna do a couple examples on this camera to show you that once you start, you need a healthy use of all of these to be in this kind of target healthy zone. Once you start going crazy on one side, you're gonna have to compensate, and and things are gonna look kind of out of whack. And so this is an example of, I have, for all intents and purposes, close to healthy amount of light coming into the camera, but my ISO is going nuts. I'm gonna, if I tried to pass this off to a client, they would say, "What the heck's going on here?" There's way too much grain here. So let's go the other way. So let's bring down the ISO to 100 and crank. This is as far as I can go with my iris, and also as far as I can go with my shutter speed. That's not going to work. So I need to compensate. I need to bring up that ISO. I'll bring up to 800. Still not good enough. I'll bring that up to 2,000.
Lower than a 30th of a second?
Not on this. And again, the reason why it limits you, and I actually like the fact that this will limit you, is because once, for that shutter speed, once we start going down to 1/15th, then remember that nice ratio of open close for every frame. Now that's being spread over 2 frames, so you'll have just weird, very weird aesthetically looking motion blur. What was that? Yeah. It's going to be kind of like strobe and yeah.
Basically, like if it's 30 frames a second and it's open for a 15th of a second, then that's going to cover 2 frames.
Exactly.
It'll be open for
Exactly.
2 frames.
Exactly. So it's using these in a combination with each other where we can actually, so if I wanted to go up to 5.6, I'd have to bring up my ISO, and we would have a lot more leeway here. The more light that you have, the more light you have in the room, the more that you can play around with these settings. But does anybody have any questions on the exposure triangle? Okay. Yeah.
So let's go back to the hummingbirds. I'm going to shoot the hummingbirds. I want a fast shutter speed, right?
Yep.
And I want a large aperture.
Dependent. If we have a large aperture, then we have. If we're at, say, so we'll use an example of a high shutter speed. We'll say 1/300ths. We'll say, okay. It's outside. We can get away with that. And we're at a low f number. So we have a shallow depth of field. We just want to see that hummingbird in our focus.
Right.
Shallow depth of field, everything else out. So we're going to bring this to 2.8.
Okay.
You know what we're going to have to do
A
here?
lot of cameras don't go that far, so you have to just go to two, right?
No, you might be able to hit 2.8. The lower that you go, the more open you are. You'll never see the lowest that you'll see. I think NASA developed something. It was actually used in a Stanley Kubrick film. It was one. It was like a 1. The ratio was f1, which is absolutely insane. But the lowest you'll see for consumer things is 1.2. But that's how as wide as you can get, and the depth of field is razor thin. But so back to the hummingbird, we have 1/300th of a second. We have f2.8. That gain or ISO better be at 0 dB or 100 ISO. And if we're outside, this is probably still not going to cut it. We still might need to use some neutral density on this guy.
What's DB again?
dB is just going to be so ISO, like the gain over here. Gain and ISO are
Decibels.
exactly. It stands for decibels, and it's going to be used.
Okay.
You might see, it might be 3 dB. Yep.
So why not go to 200 ISO? Or
If we went to
300 or 600?
Oh, you could definitely do that, but the higher you go here, you're going to have to compensate. So for instance, if you didn't have any ND filter on here,
You said the 300 and the 2.8 is still overexposed at 100.
well, the higher we get here, the more the higher that this number is, the more light we're going to be synthesizing. Oh yeah. Oh no, we initially had it at 100. Did I have it at 200?
No, you had it.
No, you had it at 100.
Oh, okay.
He asked you what would happen.
So if we went up to a 200, we would probably have to even more compensate with either our shutter speed or our f-stop. So it's just a balancing act.
It seems like there are factors that say, okay, I need either these frames per second or this f-stop, and then once you take those two or one or two factors into account, you have to compensate to get the right amount of light with one of the other factors. You have 3 factors to
Exactly.
work with. If you're doing sports, you have to set these 2 factors to be sports, so the third factor has to limit or enhance the amount
Yep.
of light.
And I would also say that your lighting and you controlling your environment is gonna be coming so handy when it comes to actually controlling how you want to get those, because you could potentially be at, if you really drowned out, if you really have really intense lights, you can be shooting at 1/300th shutter speed and still be at f22, and you'll probably be up in the ISO 800 range, but you can still do it. So. Yeah, absolutely.
How is this relevant to shooting underwater?
Underwater is going to be, that's tricky. I'm going to say that, to be honest, I'm not prepared to answer that because I've never taught that or experienced underwater shooting. I do know that light degrades very quickly as you go even just a few feet down.
Because you can't really bring lights underwater very easily.
Yeah. Well, it's expensive. It can be financially prohibitive.
Jeremy, I was wondering if you could go to the next, because it's almost 8 o'clock.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's 7:37 right now. The last thing that we'll cover here, actually, you know what? I'm going to save that composition part for when we actually have the cameras because it's going to be easier. But the last thing I'm going to talk about is when you use all of these settings that we just talked about. Okay? So I basically break it down into project, production, and shot by shot. Okay? So there's certain things that you're going to use, you're going to set at the beginning of your project, use them throughout it. There's certain things that you can set for one production and then change it the next time and be okay. There's certain things where you can be on the same shoot and have that change, okay? The thing that we really want to, if we can, stay standardized is our resolution, our frames per second and that's going to be the two main things that we really want to stick with from shoot to shoot, okay? Or for our entire project. So, and yep, that's a great one. Progressive or interlaced. We can de-interlace and you can get away with it, but if you can just if you can just keep with P. If you're in I, I would actually say if you're in I, just go to P if you can. But P or I, and those are going to be projects for your whole project, okay? Because you really don't want to go from have a great, beautiful B-roll to all of a sudden you're seeing black bar around your whole screen because you shot everything in 1080, and then all of a sudden you have 720 and you're not enlarging it. Frames per second, that aesthetic appeal. Productions, you want to set your shutter speed. And your ISO / gain. Have those pretty common. I would say too, this kind of goes up here, but there's a little bit more. There's a little bit more room. It's a little bit more forgiving. But it can, to a certain extent, change from production to production. Yep.
Just quickly, the difference between production and project.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I'm sorry. So project is going to be the scope. So say you have multiple shoots over an extended period of time, and you have different days that you need to shoot. But what we're trying to do is have a finished product that can be seamlessly edited together. The project is going to be the entire scope of that. So production is going to be on any given production that production event. So if I interview you, for instance, I want to remember all the settings. If I interview you or I interview Amber, I want those circumstances to be pretty similar. I don't want to change my resolution or frames per second in that. The shutter speed and ISO can be a little bit more forgiving, but even this one I would say is kind of teetering on this. But this is the scope of multiple shoots, and this is on every shoot. Is a shoot. Yep. And I'll clarify that too. Thank you. Production / shoot. We didn't go over it, but we'll go over it when we get into the cameras. This is going to. Oh, actually, I'll bring it down into the next one. It's actually down there. And the shot by shot, that's where we have our iris adjustments. And that's also where we have zoom. I mean, you see zoom all the time. We've come to understand zoom. As long as it's it's pretty smooth. We always want kind of a smooth zoom.
Are you talking about zooming after shooting, though, right?
Yep. So you might use it as you're shooting. So for instance, there's an event, and this zoom also camera movements. So,
movement or the angle?
Yeah, you could be changing different angles, definitely, and movements. These are things that are we've accepted. So there's dancers on stage. You have a pan of the dancers, a tilt of the dancers. Those things are definitely acceptable shot by shot. Getting your focus, you can be changing your focus from shot by shot. And the last thing over here, which we'll cover next time, is white balance. White balance always needs, whenever you change environments, you want to be changing your white balance. And
auto white balance is not good? Or
I would not recommend auto white balance. on the fact that it can, it will change all the time. So even if there's like, you move one light, that one light movement is going to change your white balance.
Change all the other two steps in.
It will. So the white balance is actually going to refer more to the warmth and coolness of the actual of your shot. So it's gonna have to do with the color of what's going on. Not necessarily. It's not going to affect our exposure, but it's going to be something that is one of those things that's glaring. Like, wow, that person is, very yellow. Yeah.
Is it appropriate then, and I'm not asking for a long diatribe, but is it appropriate to have a style sheet of some kind for shoots? You showed a 3-camera shoot there. Would it be appropriate to talk about how Zoom?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you exactly what I do when I shoot. Say I'm shooting an interview, and I have the TV, or I have all this information there, and I know I'm about to shoot. It's as simple as taking out your phone, or if you have a camera, snapping a picture of the back. That way you have all the settings that you had when you took that person. Also, another thing, and we'll go over just different production techniques that can make this stuff efficient. Spiking where your lights were, remembering exactly what lights you used, and exactly the position they were. Having tape to all 4 corners of that chair, exactly where that chair was. So there's definitely ways that you can really standardize and make it make something that is going to be a consistent product. And yeah, that's great. Yeah. So I think that does anybody have any questions on this? I think that concludes. And sorry for the it's a lot to take in at once. But once you start, the best thing I always say is once you start shooting, that's the best. Learn by trial and error. Even if you can just take out a camera, go shoot the waves, or shoot the waves on one shutter speed and go to another, and practice really makes perfect. And thank you guys for bearing with me for all this, and thank you.